Welcome back to Novel Writing 101, the 21-week course where I teach you how to write the first draft of your novel. It's week 2, and today's topic is key story decisions. Now we'll be covering 5 different key logistics of writing your novel that will have a big impact on your story. Ready? Let's get started. Before we get started today, head over to angiekadis.com/novelwriting101 to download your free worksheet because we'll be referencing it a lot today. I'm sure after crafting your premise statement last week, you're really excited to just jump into the writing, but before that, we need to tackle some key decisions. And I know this planning and preparation phase may not seem the most exciting, but the more prepared you are to write your novel, the better off your first draft will be. So today we'll be tackling 5 key topics: POV, tense, length, duration, and audience. First off, let's jump into POV. POV is point of view. It is the perspective from which you're telling this story, essentially your narrative voice. It's that lens from which readers view characters, watch events unfold, and essentially judge and take in information. How you structure your narrative is going to have a big impact on your story. But before we jump into the details, I want to give you the quick rundown of the 4 most common types of POV. First-person POV is fairly common and a little straightforward. It's you writing from the narrator experiencing the story for themselves. It utilizes I statements a lot. You'll find more elaborate examples of all the POVs in the worksheet, but essentially think of, I'm walking down the street and the wind whips through my hair. The reader is viewing the story through your eyes. Second-person POV is a lot less common, but can pack a punch in certain cases. Essentially, the reader is viewing this story through their own perspective, and it utilizes you statements. You are walking down the street, and the wind whips across your cheek. The reader is experiencing the story as if they themselves are the character. Third-person limited POV is from the perspective of the narrator observing everything that's going on, but specifically tied to one character. It utilizes he, she, and they statements. She walks down the street, and the wind whips across her cheek. A storm's coming, she thinks. Now, it's important to note in third-person limited, you're able to experience one character's thoughts and feelings and motives as if you know everything that's going on with that person. But at the same time, the narrative perspective is not all-knowing in terms of knowing everyone's thoughts and feelings and perspectives. We'll get into this a little bit later when we talk about head hopping, but let's jump over to our last POV. Third-person omniscient POV is also from that perspective of the narrator observing the story for themselves. But unlike limited, it doesn't have that deep tie to one specific character. This is more of a godlike eye-in-the-sky perspective that can see everything that's happening all at once. It utilizes he, she, and they statements as well, but doesn't get deep into that internal monologue of a character. She walks down the street, and the wind whips across her cheek. Around the corner, a man stumbles out of the bank, duffel bag half unzipped and ski mask covered in sweat. Throughout my reading journey, I found that third-person omniscient isn't as common, but don't let that deter you, because if you're drawn to that style, run with it. However, I do want you to know about one common pitfall, which is head hopping. Now, sometimes people accidentally bleed aspects of third-person omniscient into third-person limited, where they focus specifically on one character deep in their head and getting those thoughts and motives and feelings, but then they jump back and forth between other characters at the same time. And this can be really jarring for the reader and pull them out of the story because they don't know who they should be focusing on, who's doing what, who's feeling what, and it's kind of just all over the place. I go into a little bit more detail in the worksheet about what head hopping looks like in an actual written example, but just know that if you're jumping from one character's inner monologue to the next, you're probably head hopping. And that doesn't go to say that you can't get the perspectives from multiple characters in the same book, because you totally can. You just have to keep it confined to its own part, essentially a chapter, where the reader has a distinct understanding of, okay, now we're in this person's head. Okay, now we're in this person's head, instead of bouncing them back and forth where they can't keep track of really what's going on. Now, another thing to consider when you're looking at POV is how it relates to genre unofficially. If you go to a bookstore, you'll notice that a lot of traditionally published books in the same genre have similar POVs. For instance, a lot of thrillers and crime novels are written in third-person limited. And this is because Third person limited caters well to following a character along and getting clues revealed to the reader one at a time. But that's not to say that's the only way that can be done. First person POV can be great to hide things from the reader and reveal big plot twists. So don't think that just because a lot of people do something one way, that's the only way to do it. Because again, like I say over and over, this novel is for you. You should write it how you want to write it. So you can keep industry conventions and standards in mind, but know that your book is your decision. Now the last thing to consider when it comes to POV is how many characters get their time to shine. Single POV is where we follow a single character through the entirety of the book. And this is pretty common. But maybe you want something a little bit different. Maybe you have a large cast and they're off doing different things at the same time, but it all relates to the larger plot. This is where multiple POV can come into play. Multiple POV can help reveal information, move subplots along, and encompass a more complex, broader plot. Also, if you are drawn to third-person limited perspective, but do want to get in more characters' heads, multiple POV is the exact way to do that. You simply, like I said earlier, designate one chapter for one character and one for the next, and so on and so forth. You can jump back and forth between characters however you want. And that way everyone gets their time to shine, but the reader knows what's going on. Now I want to take one of our example premises from week 1 and show you how single versus multiple POV can push the premise in one direction and push it in another. We're going to use the premise example. A woman finds herself in the middle of a global invasion with nothing but the clothes on her back and an unwelcome alliance with someone she swore to forget. Now, single POV allows us to follow this main character through this harrowing experience of an alien invasion. We can see how the first day goes, how she gets out of the city, how she then has to survive, and then when this secondary character, this unwelcome alliance, comes into play, we get to see how she reacts to that and how this character supports and is secondary to her journey. It's a great way to keep your focus specifically on your main character, what they're going through, their past traumas, their present traumas, their character development as a whole. But now, if we take that same premise and introduce multiple POV, it gives us more to play with and can change the story significantly. Multiple POV still allows us to follow this woman through this journey of this alien invasion and how she survives, but it also gives us the opportunity to jump over to the secondary character at the same time and see how they're coping with this. We can bounce the reader back and forth between these characters, how their journeys may be parallel or contrasting, and maybe they're coming to the same destination, and it's building all this tension and excitement of what's going to happen when these two characters collide. Like I said before, multiple POV can be great when you have a large cast of characters whose fates and futures are intertwined in some way, or when you have characters working in opposition on some problem that's going to come to a head. At the end of the day, it's up to you to find the best way to tell your story, and it's your preference and creativity that's going to take it there. Now that we've talked about POV, I want you to go to the worksheet and brainstorm how POV can impact your premise. Maybe you're really drawn to first-person POV, but you're not sure if you want to follow one character or multiple. Or maybe you want to take a godlike approach and use third-person omniscient to see what's going on at all times. Whatever you choose, explore each and every possibility. If you're saving the homework for later in the week when you have more time, that's no problem at all. Just make a note that you need to complete this before you jump to week 3's lecture. Okay, that's all things POV. Now let's jump into our next topic, tense. Tense is the moment in time in which you're telling this story. And I'm not going to make it more complicated than it is. Tense is pretty simple. We have past tense, which is retelling a story that's already been told, and we have present tense, telling a story in the moment. Now, aside from just your general preference on whether you want to write past or present tense, I also want you to consider your narrator and how they might relate to and impact the story. Now, when I wrote my first book, I wasn't thinking about tense in this way. I was just like, I'm writing a horror novel. A lot of horror novels are written past tense. Past tense feels right. I'm going to write past tense. But then, in the years since then, now that I've thought about it, I realized, oh, your narrator has a big impact on what your tense should or shouldn't be. Because let's use an example of writing a first-person POV about a character who survives a horrible accident. Now, this could be written in past or present tense, maybe because we just want to pick either one, but really because this person is a survivor of an event, meaning they survived. And if you really think about it, if the character doesn't survive, should the book be in past tense if it's from their perspective? No, it shouldn't, because they wouldn't be alive to retell the story. And maybe you don't want to think about it this deeply, but it is good to keep in mind when you're thinking about what tense and what POV and who the narrator is. Thinking about tense and your narrator in this way can offer a lot of exciting opportunities you might not have thought of before. For example, let's take the same example of writing from the perspective of a character who survived a horrible accident, and they're speaking in past tense, they're telling the story that's already happened to them. But what if we broke the narrative for a second in the middle of the book? What if we zoomed out to present tense and it was this same narrator, however many years later, telling this story to a stranger in a dark bar? Okay? Now we have this really interesting dynamic of like, okay, they're retelling this story. We've been pulled out of the first story and we're in the second story all of a sudden. What does this mean? Are we going to show that the main character, the survivor, has changed drastically since the story was originally happening? Maybe they've been like gravely injured. Maybe the world around them is so different from what it was when the story was happening. It can add so many interesting layers if you just think about your narrator as its own thing and how it could relate to how you, the writer, are telling the story. Now, you don't have to get too deep into it. Like I said, you can just say, Angie, I really love writing past tense. I'm going to write this book in past tense and call it good. That's totally fine. But I do want you to start thinking of things in different ways and trying to expand your mind to more possibilities. Okay, we've officially talked about tense, so you know what time it is. Grab your worksheet and I want you to jot down a few notes on how you're going to approach tense in your story. And again, if you're saving your homework for later in the week, just make a mental note that you need to come back and do this. Now, length isn't the most exciting of topics compared to our others, but I do want you to dedicate some time to think about it. Now, before you write your novel, there's no way you're going to be able to determine exactly how many words you're going to end up with. But it's good to have a ballpark range in mind that you can shoot for. It's also a great time to consider if you do want to write a full-length novel, or if maybe your story is suited for something else. Here are some generalized ranges for different story lengths. And it's good to note that on average, a novel is about 200 to 300 words per page, depending on the size of the book, the font, the margins, but on average it's somewhere in between there. So if you take these numbers and divide it by 200 or 300, it'll give you roughly the amount of pages you can expect. Y'all know I hate to talk about industry standards, but I think when it comes to length, the more information you have, the better. So here are some common genre expectations when it comes to word count. Now, these ranges are good to keep in mind if you want to query your novel and get agent representation, essentially if you want to be traditionally published, because a lot of agents won't accept manuscripts that are above and below these certain ranges. But if you're seeking indie publishing like I've gone through, use these expectations more of a guideline than a hard and fast rule. You don't need to spend too much time toiling over what your estimated word count should be. Just pick a range you're comfortable with and jot the notes down in your worksheet. Depending on what you're writing, this next decision is going to be either really easy or a little stressful. And I'm talking about duration. Essentially, how many stories is it going to take to tell your story? Is your book a series or a standalone? A standalone is a singular book that contains a complete narrative and does not require any other materials to be read. This is really common for a lot of literary fiction or horror or thriller novels. Now, a series is exactly that. It's a collection of books that guides the reader through a connected narrative that leads to a final outcome or event. And this is really common in a lot of fantasy and sci-fi, because a lot of the times those have very complex worlds and world building that take more time to tell the story. Now, I've given some really high-level pros and cons about series and standalone in the worksheet, but I don't want you to force your story to be something it's not. Like, don't stretch your storyline out into a series just because series are popular right now. Or don't try to condense your story into one book if you have more to tell, but you're afraid of getting reader buy-in for a series. Whether you write a series or a standalone should be 100% determined by how much story you have to tell. I will say that, from personal experience, tackling a series is not to be taken lightly. There's a lot to consider. There's a lot that goes into a series in multiple books with one connected narrative. But if you feel passionate about it and you feel like, Angie, this story needs to be a series, I need to expand upon this world, I have so much to tell, then go for it. Don't let the daunting aspect of a series deter you, just go for it, but know what you're getting into. Okay, now I want you to go back to your premise and really think about how long it's going to take to tell this story fully and in the best way possible. The worksheet has a lot of space for you to jot down your notes and, again, explore every possibility. So maybe you wrote your premise statement and then wrote down some notes on character and genre, and you were like, I thought this was going to be one book, but this is a perfect duology. Or maybe you're like, actually, I had these grand ambitions for like a trilogy, and I think telling one book first is like a really great way to explore this. Whatever you come up with, jot your notes down, do the homework, and meet me in the next section. Okay, I'm hoping this is the easiest decision you'll have to make today, and that is audience. Essentially, who this story is for. So the market today is generally categorized into these age ranges, and I'm going to give you a very quick rundown of what they all mean. So middle grade is books for kids, YA or young adult is books for teenagers, new adult is a new category between YA and adult that's trying to bridge the gap. So think of it as college-aged readership and college-age characters going through similar milestones of that age demographic. So college, entering the workforce, maybe first relationships, navigating what it means to be a new adult, essentially. And then adult is 18 plus, the rest of us, it's a very broad category. And it doesn't have to, but often it contains themes that are only appropriate for adults, like sex and violence and trauma. Jumping back to the worksheet, I want you to think about how your premise statement can cater to one of these audiences. And really think about it, because maybe you're realizing, okay, I actually want to make this fantasy novel middle grade. Or I'm intrigued by this new adult audience, like it already has a lot of these same themes, like what if I pivoted a little and did this? Wherever your intuition is taking you, follow that and really explore again all the possibilities of who your audience should be. So take some time to work this out and then meet me in our final section. Okay, we're almost done. I know I've thrown a lot at you, but we're going to go back to our worksheet and do one final exercise. I want you to take a moment and think about these key decisions and make some final ones for your story. So think about POV, tense, length, duration, and audience, and go to the worksheet's last page, and there's a section for you to fill all this out so you have it on hand. Now, if you need more time to sit with all this information I've thrown at you, no worries at all. You can get it done later in the week, but I do want you to make sure that you get it done this week. Not only is it going to be important for going into lecture 3, but I'm also giving you another homework assignment later in the week. That one is a lot more fun and easy, but I don't want you to put this off for too long because it is so important. And if you need someone to study with and work with, I will be posting another Wednesday Study With Me video where we'll just be sitting quietly together, working on homework, listening to some lo-fi. And then I also have my Friday office hours video where you can ask me any lingering questions you have. Congrats, you made it through another lecture. Thank you for being here. We are one step closer to getting to the actual writing process. Thank you for bearing with me. I know this planning and preparation phase isn't the most exciting when you just want to get in and write your book, but I promise you it is important, and all this time we're taking is going to pay off. That's it for today. Now, like I said, you're going to have one more homework assignment and mini lecture later this week. It's on inspiration, so it's a lot more fun. It's not stressful, don't worry. And then next week's lecture, we're going to jump into outlining. Lots of great stuff to come. Thank you for being here. And as always, don't forget to do your homework, and I'll see you next time.